Good morning and welcome to the Art Class Online. I'm Nicholas Wyatt, and this talk, entitled Painting the Modern City, London, will look at how painters have responded to uh, making paintings of London in the past roughly 200 years. Just a brief intro. Um, The PowerPoint will look at how painters in the past 200 years have represented the modern city of London. The city of London has been the subject of paintings from the early 17th century and into the 18th century as mainly topographical views of London, perhaps best represented by the Italian vedute painter Canaletto. However, Britain's maritime trade, the growth of empire and rapid industrialization in the 19th century sees London becoming the biggest city of Europe in the world by 1900, city of empire in the world by 1900. These socio-economic changes both attracted artists to London and to paint London in new ways and in ways that cities had never been represented in paint before. The following series of slides gives an outline of the varieties of responses by painters to London in the past 200 years. So that just basically gives you a kind of an overview of what we're going to look at. And we're going to start with a kind of a well, you could argue it's a pre-industrial view of London by Canaletto. And it's the view of Thames looking downriver from the terrace of Somerset House down towards St. Paul's. I'm not going to dwell on this painting too long because it's the starting point of what were to become many changes in the way London's represented. But one or two things to say about this: it's essentially a painting of record. It's a topographical view, and it's a marvelous record of the river, the width of the river, and the many, many churches that you can see here, the steeples of which, dot the horizon line. He presumably used a camera obscura because in order to get the perspective. But this is painted about the middle to sort of like the third quarter of the 18th century. His paintings were much sought after. But quite soon after this, this sort of topographical view of record of a city was replaced by a kind of a much greater kind of individualistic way of looking at the world, but also looking at cities. And in the second slide, we've jumped forward probably about 70 or 80 years to the painting by Joseph Mallord William Turner of the burning of the Houses of Parliament in 1834. And Turner situated himself, I think, in a boat on the river and at various other locations, made watercolor sketches, and from those watercolor sketches painted this and a couple of other works. But you can see in the space of those 70 years, a rapid transformation in terms of how you represent a city has occurred. Turner's kind of romantic view of this kind of almost like a natural phenomena of fire consuming the heart of government of this country. And he's kind of really focused on the atmosphere, the color of the event, with this central kind of conflagration of warm colors surrounded by the cooler tones of the river. And it points the way. He was ahead of his time by a good 60 years really, or certainly 40 or 50 years. And he is a kind of a way marker for modern painting. But before London was painted by other artists, British-born artists were painting London in the height of the Victorian era. And here's a painting by a mid-Victorian artist called Ford Madox Brown. I think he's sometimes associated with the Pre-Raphaelite movement, which was the 1850s in London. And it's a kind of, the painting is really a kind of, it's a commentary on, first of all, how London was being changed by the the digging up of streets. I mean, it wouldn't be very soon after this that the first underground lines were laid in London, because London was going through this incredibly rapid industrialized growth. But it's also slightly a moral comment on the sort of the value, the moral value of good, honest labour. And it's also a statement on class, because you've got quite well-heeled people here and in the background, and walking past the navvies. So it's quite complex in its social and moral meanings, and shouldn't just be taken at face value. Here's a detail of the painting. And can you see it's sort of like very rendered in great detail, which is a kind of a fairly common feature of mid-Victorian painting, especially that of the Pre-Raphaelite movement. But the state of London in the mid-19th century was a cause for much concern. Dickens was writing about the conditions of the poor in London at the time, and a French illustrator, Gustave Doré, was making prints of the working conditions of people who lived in the inner cities. And I don't think I've got the title completely right on this print. It's a very famous print of Doré's, but it shows the overhead railway lines and viaducts that were kind of dissecting the city of London, and beneath which were basically back-to-back housing, overcrowded conditions. It was a major source of concern for certainly the liberal intelligentsia in London, and even Charles Dickens, as I've mentioned, wrote about it, the politician Gladstone, and Van Gogh would have, the Dutch painter Van Gogh was in London at about this time, and if you read his letters, writes about his concerns and responses to the great poverty he saw in London. So you have a city which is in the throes of rapid change, and it's also, because it's becoming, I think it probably is by now, the world's biggest city. It also attracts painters. It attracted Gustave Doré. It attracted this painter, James Tissot. And we're looking at a period of, I would think, the 1870s. Now, in distinction to what was happening in Paris in the 1870s, which I'll come to in a minute, Tissot was a painter of social observation and social class and social manners. But the reason I've shown this, I mean, it's painted in a fairly kind of, if you like, illustrative way. But but Tissot comes up with some interesting compositional devices. So he's situated the viewpoint from someone on this boat, which is plying the Thames with some very well-heeled people sitting back and enjoying the view. And this would have been the Pool of London. So they're essentially basically going down to the London docks and seeing this sort of heart of empire where trade comes in. From an artistic point of view, I find it quite interesting in terms of the way he's arranged the composition. This great wedge, this compositional foreground wedge of the protagonists, the the indicators of social class on this yacht. You can see even their bottles of champagne and so on, set against the backdrop of these iron hulks, the great trading ships of the time. Now a lot of the paintings that were of London were of the river, and another artist, and another émigré artist who painted the river, but in quite a different way, is James Abbott McNeill Whistler. And this is Old Battersea Bridge on the Thames at Chelsea. And if any of you have any background in art history, you can see quite clearly there's an influence of Japanese prints in Whistler's painting. There was a great vogue for Japanese prints, both in London and in Paris, towards the latter part of the 19th century. Some of these prints would literally line the cases of tea chests and so on. But they became very admired and sought after by artists working in London. So he's created a very atmospheric scene. It's a scene full of the mood of the river, because it's almost a monochrome painting of blues. He's got blues and some warmer tones of yellow and gold in it, and then these dark sort of raw umber tones. But he's virtually set it up really almost like a sort of a Japanese or a Chinese composition, because of the way he's dealing with the space in the painting. We read the space of the painting from bottom to top vertically. In other words, he's flattened the space until he's not using traditional Western perspective. He's tilted the whole space up to the picture plane. And that's a feature of Far Eastern art. And the colouring is very, I would imagine you'd call it sort of, mood provoking. And Whistler was part of a kind of aesthetic sensibility at the time that believed in art for art. In other words, the purpose of a painting was not to educate, explain, or somehow kind of sort of be pedantic, but actually to act on the not just the senses, but to act as an aesthetic vehicle. In other words, a painting was there to both stimulate the senses and to evoke reflection and contemplation. It was a very aesthetic way of looking at the purpose of paintings, and was part of the kind of was quite a modern sensibility for its time. Um, Now, about the time this was painted, in Paris, France was invaded by Prussia in the early 1870, in fact, and the city of Paris came under siege. Now, in 1870 in Paris, French painters were working there. Painters, uh, major impressionist painters like Monet, Sisley, and Pissarro. And I'm just going to spend a little bit of time talking about the effect that the exile of French impressionist painters had on the way London was represented in art. So we're going to start with Monet. I mean, Sisley and Pissarro, certainly Pissarro moved his whole family over to London. And the three of them, Monet, Sisley and Pissarro, were obviously fellow French comrades in exile. And this is interesting because it's it's just before the first Impressionist exhibition in Paris in 1874. This painting of Westminster was painted in 1871. Renoir and Monet. Renoir, I think, stayed in Paris during the siege of Paris, but um, Renoir and Monet had been painting the Seine, the River Seine, down at there's a place called La Grenouillière, and you can see the paintings they made there in the National Gallery. And it's in the paintings of La Grenouillière that you actually see the first kind of blossoming of the Impressionist style. But that I think La Grenouillière was painted in 1869. This is a couple of years later in 1871, but you're beginning to see what Impressionism is doing by now. And it's basically breaking down the view, in this case, an urban view, city houses of parliament, into perceptions, how the artist, the sensations that the artist receives and the perceptions that the artist receives, and recording the appearance of an image on the canvas in broken brushstrokes, which are brush marks of colour placed next to one another, and the placing of those brush marks next to one another, work on the eye optically. So the eye kind of blends the colours optically. They're not blended necessarily on the canvas as in previous painting. And here you see Monet has created this wonderfully atmospheric scene of the Thames in 1871. And he would go on to paint the area around here very many times. Sisley also painted the Thames looking down the other way toward Charing Cross Bridge. And here you've got the wharfs on the south side of the river. And I suspect that's St. Paul's there. And there's you can, when I talked about the broken brushstrokes, you can quite clearly see what is happening. It's a kind of almost like an optical dapple and a flicker, and it's bringing so much life and energy to this scene with its atmosphere. It's atmospheric perspective where the blues, the cooler colours, take the eye into recession, and the warmer tones here bring the forms closer. Sisley also explored the upper reaches of the Thames at Hampton Court, and I mean, this is a very sort of bold composition. People like Renoir and Monet had experimented with compositions under bridges or by bridges in Paris, I think, and no doubt perhaps I'm sure Sisley had as well. And it was looking to they were all looking to portray, the life of a city. That is what one of the major components of Impressionism was about. It was the painting of modern life. And here you can see, well-heeled people enjoying the life of leisure on the banks of the Thames at Hampton Court, rowing and so on. Here's another scene he painted at um, Hampton Court. So, a city is a vast, complex organism, and artists have found very many ways of responding to a city socially, economically, aesthetically. It's even atmospherically. So, for example, Pizarro managed to set up home in South London. I think actually in the area around Norwood. And this painting is in the National Gallery. You have this wonderful, quite small painting of Upper Norwood in 1871. And in my view, it's an impressionist masterpiece. You can sort of sense that sort of the kind of the dying light on a winter, presumably a winter's afternoon, and then literally the sheer chill in the air. His the thing to realize about Pizarro is his tonal values were unsurpassed. He could relate tonal values one to another with the greatest degree of accuracy. And he doesn't get he uses detail where he needs to use detail, but he doesn't become a slave to detail. I mean, this whole foreground area of the foliage and the bushes here is painted in these sort of like sort of chocolate browns, these maroons and greens. And there is enough detail, but he doesn't overwhelm you with it. And the figures walking up the road, walking up the lane. His use of these blue greys for the cooler shadows in the snow, absolutely amazing. He was a very important recorder of the suburbs of London in the 1870s, and the suburbs were growing at this time. So here is his painting of Crystal Palace in 1871, and there you can see it moved Crystal Palace for the glass. I'll move on to his next one. Was actually, this is Crystal Palace. It was actually originally erected in Hyde Park in 1850 for the Great Exhibition, and then moved to this area of southeast London, which became known as Crystal Palace. And Pizarro also painted Dulwich College. Again, another kind of essay in conciseness with painting, saying no more than he absolutely needs to say, but communicating so much about the autumn light. It's vibrant. This is what Impressionism was revealing to the world. That the life of a modern city. Here's his painting of Sydenham. Again, this is important, this one, because it's again in the National Gallery, I think. Compositionally, it's very, very clever. He's balancing out the painting with these verticals. It's almost like one, two, it's thirds. The church tower marks the third. These trees here mark the other third. And this perspective of the road, it's compositionally very, very well balanced, this painting. And this is what you should be thinking about in your paintings, like balancing out verticals against horizontals, using the classic compositional device of thirds. You don't always have to use it, but it's a kind of a classic harmonious balancing composition. Here's the one he painted of Crystal Palace, the road it was on, and my goodness, what a um, an incredible painting of light and shadow, and just this sense of light. The shadow areas here, again painted very simply, and then the way the Crystal Palace is reflecting the light of the sky, and then the long shadows because he's painting into the sun. It's absolutely spectacular painting. So there were other French painters and Italians who were working in London in the 1870s. Here we have Giuseppe Donizetti, quite different from the Impressionists, much more of a kind of, I suppose you would describe as a sort of realist artist or naturalist artist, in the sense that the actual recording of facts were more important to him than the perceptions. With the Impressionists, it was the perceptions, and there's something rather more illustrational and factual about the paintings of Donizetti. However, I think he was influenced by what was happening in the Impressionist movement, because we have his painting here of Westminster Bridge, and I mean, this is very kind of Impressionist, the way he's dealing here with the Houses of Parliament, shrouded in a kind of atmosphere of colour and smoke. Because you have to remember, at the time, London was burning coal fires, and the coal fires were creating great smogs in London. And you can begin to see it in these paintings by Monet. He had a hotel suite at the Savoy, and he would paint the south bank of the river. And here's Waterloo Bridge, and the whole of the south bank is caught in a haze. Again, using this incredible sort of Impressionist technique. And just to give you, I mean, Monet would work on several canvases at a time and to record the changing effects of light. So I'm just going to show you 3 in succession of Waterloo Bridge, and you can just see how beautifully nuanced his eye was. This, I would imagine, in the evening sunlight, again with this wonderful sort of soupy smog to it, and the colours are just awesome. Then in a much more subdued evening light, and this would be in the evening because the sun's coming from the west, and then that a very sort of cool, smoky light. And I mean, just to show how discriminating his eye was, I'm just going to flick between these two. And this is how you use colour and tone to the most discriminating degree, where he was painting on series. He was the painter who invented series painting. And when you can discriminate colour and light to that degree, you'll be making some incredible paintings. I'm going to have an interval at this part of the talk and resume in a few minutes, when we'll look at more recent paintings of London. So for the time being now, I'm going to stop the recording and resume later on.